Pat Ryan. I'm a storyteller. Cork City Libraries have asked me to tell you some stories as part of their holiday season of events. I've come to Cork many times to tell stories in libraries to children whose schools are invited to their local branch. And I'm sorry we can't do that this year. But I hope you like the stories I have. Now, today I'm going to tell a story that I learned from a friend of mine. His name was Duncan Williamson. Now, Duncan was a Scots-Traveller. And I find that Scottish travellers and Irish travellers have many, many wonderful stories and songs. And I've been lucky enough that they have told me lots of stories, the people I've met, the friends I've made amongst the travelling community. And so this is one I got from Duncan. He knows thousands of stories. Now, when he told me this story, he told me something interesting about it. When he was a little boy, when it came to Christmas time, some years his father would gather the family together and he'd say to Duncan and his brothers and sisters, "Children, I'm sorry. We've no money this year, so Father Christmas will not be visiting. We'll have no toys. We'll have no games for presents. But I will give you something better. I will tell you a story. Toys may break and games you get bored with, but a story, it'll stay with you in your heart to make you happy. And so I'll tell you a story for Christmas." And Duncan's father did. And this story is one of the stories that Duncan got from his father, and then he gave it to me. Once upon a time there was a king, and everyone said this king was the wisest and most clever man in the world. But one day, this king asked a stupid question. Now, the king did not think it was a stupid question. No. He thought this question was going to help him solve a problem. You see, the king was very old. He knew he wasn't going to be king forever. He wouldn't be around for much longer. And he began to wonder, who will take my place? Who will be the king or the queen when I'm gone? Now, the king did have children to do this. The king had 3 children. He had 3 daughters. And these princesses, they were all very wise and very clever and very good and kind. Any one of the princesses would have made a good queen. But that was a problem. Which one to choose? So that's when the king thought of the question. He thought, whoever gives me the best answer, she'll be the one to take my place when I'm gone. So he called his children in. And he said to his daughters, he said, "My children, soon I'll be gone. I'm not long for this world. One of you will have to take my place." And they said, "Oh no, father, you're not so old. Don't say things like that." He said, "But it's true. But that's not what I'm worried about. I want to know who's going to take my place. Which one of you is going to be the queen when I am gone? So listen well, I've decided to do this. I am going to ask you a question, and whoever gives me the best answer, she will be the queen." And this is the question he asked. The king said, "My children, tell me this. How much do you love me?" Now imagine that. Do you think fathers and mothers should ask questions like that? No. I mean, they already know how much you love them, right? But the king asked the question, and his daughters had to answer. He was their father and the king. And you know, children always talk politely to their fathers and mothers and answer their questions, don't they? Well, the first princess said, "Father, I love you more than all the gold in the world." Well, you could see what she was thinking of, but the answer made the king very happy. The second princess, she said, "Father, I love you more than all the silver in the world." Oh, you could see what made her heart glad. And it made the king happy too, that answer did. Now the third princess, I think, was the most clever, the wisest of the 3. I think the king wanted her to give the best answer. And when he said to her, "How much do you love me?" the third princess said, "Father, I love you more than salt." More than salt. More than salt, said the king. You stupid goose, he shouted. You only love me more than salt. Didn't you hear what your sister said? They love me more than gold and silver. You don't love me enough. Give a better answer. No, said the princess. I love you more than salt. That's all there is to it. The poorest people in our country have got salt, said the king. Salt is nothing. Nothing comes from nothing. Think again. Give me an answer. She said, I won't. Well then, said the king, you are not my child. You do not belong to this family. You don't love me enough. From this day on, you are banished. Never again do we live in the same place, under the same roof. Never again do we look eye to eye or see face to face. You're gone. Get out. Go! Well, the princess burst into tears. How could her father be so mean? She tried to explain what she meant, but oh, the king was so angry, and you all know what grown-ups are like when they're angry. You know, when mums and dads are angry, do they listen to what the children say? Ah, no, they often don't. The two sisters started making fun of the youngest. But then sisters and brothers, they do tease and make fun, don't they? She didn't mind them. She tried to get her father to change his mind, but he wouldn't, and so that day the princess had to leave. Out she went. She left the castle all on her own. She went without family or friends, with no servants to help, no soldiers to protect her. She walked out of the castle. Oh, she was weeping and crying. She couldn't stop. She wandered through the city, and people pointed at her and whispered and said, that's the daughter who made the king so angry. She didn't care. She didn't notice. She was crying so hard. The princess wandered out of the city into the country. Even there, the country people had heard what she had said, what the king had done. They wouldn't go near her. But again, all she cared about was her broken heart. Weeping and crying, the princess walked and walked and walked until the road took her to the end of her father's kingdom. Now there, the road crossed over to other lands. But she didn't cross the border. For some reason, the princess wandered off the road onto a path, and the path took her down into a dark, dark forest. Now the princess didn't mind that either. She was still weeping and crying. She didn't think of the wild beasts that might tear her apart who lived in that wood, or the robbers who might jump upon her and hurt her. No, weeping and crying, she wandered through the woods. Now, luckily, she came upon a cottage in that forest, a tiny little cottage, and in front of it stood an old woman. Now, this woman was so old, her back was all bent. And her nose was so big and long that when she bent over on her walking stick, her nose nearly touched the ground. Well, this old woman saw the princess crying, so she asked a question like anyone would. She said, "What's wrong with you? Girl, why are you crying?" Now, you know when you're upset and you cry and somebody asks, "What are you crying for?" And it only makes you cry more, it makes everything worse and you can't talk. That's the way it was with the princess. She just cried more and more. And the old woman said, where are my manners? You can't tell me what's wrong when you're crying like that. What you need is a cup of tea. Have you noticed? When people get upset, grown-ups always think of making a cup of tea. Like that will make everything better. Well, the old woman said, "You want a cup of tea? Come on into the house with me. I'll make you a cup of tea." So the princess went into the house with the old woman, and the old woman had the princess sit down in a nice, comfortable rocking chair right by the fireplace. And then the old woman went to make the tea. Well, the princess sat in the chair crying, and as she did so, into the house came a big old fat black cat. And the cat chased his tail around 3 times. You know the way that cats do. And then the cat leapt up onto the lap of the princess. Now, even though she was weeping, you can't ignore a cat when it sits on your lap. The princess couldn't. She began to scratch the cat's ears, to tickle the tum of the cat. And soon that cat was purring away, ever so content. Just at that moment, the old woman came in with a tray of tea with a tray of tea things, you know, a pot of tea and a jug of milk and a bowl of sugar and cups and saucers and plates piled high with homemade cakes and homemade biscuits. And the old woman said, "Oh, now look at that. Oh, my old Tom is a fussy cat. He doesn't like people. But he's sitting on your lap purring away. That proves that you have a good heart, my darling. Now here, drink some tea, eat some cake and biscuits, and now you tell me your story." Well, the princess did. At last she stopped crying and she could speak. Because nobody can cry when they get a nice comfy chair to sit in by a fire. And when they have a cup of tea in one hand and a plate piled high with cake and biscuits in the other, and even more when they have a black cat purring away on their lap. When they get all that around them, they forget their sorrows and they stop crying. You try that. I hope it doesn't happen to you, but next time you're sad, get a comfy place to sit with something to cuddle and something nice to eat and drink. I promise you'll feel better. The princess did, and she told her story to the old woman about her father the king being so angry. And the old woman listened to this story, and she said, "Well, your father the king is a stupid idiot. He's an old fool. Someone needs to teach that king a lesson." "Well, that may be," said the princess, "but I've no one to live with no place to stay, and no one to take care of me." And she nearly started to cry again. "Stuff all that nonsense. No more crying," said the old woman. "You do have a place to live. You can stay with me and my old cat, my old Tom. We'll take care of you." And so the princess did. She stayed with the old woman and her cat. That night, the old woman tucked the princess into bed. And when the princess was asleep, the old woman crept down the stairs, opened up a cupboard under the stairs, and she took out a long black cape and wrapped it round herself. And then she took out from the cupboard a big, tall, pointy black hat. And she put that hat on her head. Then she picked up her walking stick and walked out of the cottage, and the black cat followed. When they came to the middle of the forest, the old woman, she traced a circle on the ground with her walking stick. And then she began to sing. Oh, strange, queer words I can't repeat, because if I did, you wouldn't really know how to use them, would you? You wouldn't understand them. But she sang very strange words, and as the old woman sang, the black cat jumped up onto his hind legs and danced a jig. For you see, she wasn't really an old woman. She was a witch. And she and the black cat made some magic that night. That night, the witch made a magic spell that caused all the salt in the land to disappear. It all just melted away like the mist in the morning when the sun comes up. By the morning time, there was not a handful of salt, not a pinch of salt, not an even little grain of salt anywhere in the kingdom, not in the castle or in the city or in any of the towns or villages, no salt in any house or shop or factory or store, no salt anywhere in the land. And when the salt was all gone, morning had come, and the old witch and the cat went back to the cottage, very proud and pleased of the work they did that night. And at the same time, the king woke up in the castle, and he went to eat his breakfast. Now, the king was one of those old men who likes to have a big fry-up in the morning for his breakfast, and put loads of salt on it. But there was no salt that day. There was no salt for the eggs or the rashers or the sausages or the pudding or the toast or the bread or nothing. Well, the king got grumpy. He didn't like the taste of the food without salt. So he called for the cook and he said, "What's wrong with the breakfast? It tastes rotten." Well, you shouldn't tell the one who cooks a breakfast that it tastes rotten. Cooks don't like to have their food criticized. And so that put the cook in a bad mood. And she said, "Don't be a stupid idiot, Your Majesty. I can't make decent food when there's no salt." "No salt," said the king. "Well, then go get some salt if we're out of salt." Well, the cook and the servants, they tried to do that. They went out everywhere looking for salt, but there was no salt to be found. They looked all over the country, but nobody had salt. The king was getting desperate. Without salt, he would not eat. So he ordered his soldiers to go out to other countries. He told the army to buy salt, to borrow salt, to beg salt, even to steal salt. Didn't do any good, only caused trouble. Any salt them soldiers managed to bring back melted away, disappeared like a puff of smoke in the wind. And so there was no salt, and without salt, the king would not eat. And without eating, that old man soon got very, very sick and poorly. He was desperate. The king proclaimed that should anyone bring him a handful of salt, if anyone could do it, he would pay any price. Why, he would even give up his kingdom. He would give up his job and make the one king or queen, the one who brought him salt. But nobody was able to do this. Now, all the time, the princess lived with the old witch. I don't think she really knew it was a witch that she was with. The old woman was so kind to her that the princess grew to love her very much. But one day the witch was very sad, and the princess said, "Why are you sad, Granny?" And the old witch said, "Oh, because the time has come. Today you must leave me." "Oh, no, don't do that," said the princess. "Don't make me go away. Oh, my father did that. Don't you do the same." "Oh, no, my dear, you must leave me. You must go back to your father the king," said the witch. "Are you mad?" said the princess. "My father hates me. If I go back to the king, he'll lock me in the tower. He'll throw me in the dungeon. Why, he might even cut off my head." "Oh, he might," said the witch, "but I don't think so. I think he's learned his lesson. I do believe he has. No, I tell you, if you go back to your father the king, my dear, you will become the next queen." "I won't be queen, I'm telling you. My father hates me," said the princess. "You'll be the queen if you do as I tell you," said the witch. "Now do what I say. Take off your dress, take off your shoes, give them to me." Well, the princess did as she was bid. She took off her beautiful silk gown and her satin slippers and handed them to the old witch. Well, the witch took the pair of slippers that she gave her, and she took those slippers and she put them into her apron pocket. And then she pulled them out right away. But in that instant, they were no longer slippers. She pulled out a pair of scissors. And with the scissors, she took the silk gown and she cut up the dress until it was all tatters and rags. "Put this on and kneel before me," commanded the witch. Well, the princess put on the raggedy dress and knelt down, and the witch reached over and she grabbed hold of the long, black, curly hair of the princess. And then she took the scissors and she cut all the hair off the princess's head, so the princess was nearly bald. Then the witch put the scissors back into her apron pocket. Then she reached into the fireplace and scooped up the ashes and soot and cinders, all the dirt around the fire. And she took this and she rubbed it onto the face and the head and the hands of the princess. "There now," said the old witch. "No one will know who you are now." And that is true. With her baldy head, her dirty face and hands, her raggedy dress and bare feet, they would never recognize her as a princess. She looked like an old beggar girl. "Now," said the witch, "now do this. Go to my kitchen and get some salt, 3 handfuls of salt from the crock on the table, and put them into the wee bag you see there and bring it to me." Well, the princess went to the kitchen and fetched 3 handfuls of salt and brought the bag of salt to the witch. "Now," said the witch, "take this salt to the king. Go to your father and give the salt to him and no one else. And if you do that, you will become queen." "I won't become the queen," said the princess. "You will be the queen," said the witch. "And when you become the queen, do you promise to remember the old woman in the wood with her silly old cat?" "I couldn't forget you. Why, old woman, I love you so. You're like my granny. And with that, the princess kissed the old witch goodbye, and she headed out, walked up the path through the forest, back onto the road, back through the countryside, back to the city. Well, when she got to the city, everyone came to stare at her. They had never seen such a dirty, filthy little beggar girl. Why, they threw mud at her, shouted names at her. She didn't care. They didn't know she was really the princess. She got to the castle gate, and the soldiers there said, "What do you want, ragamuffin?" And she said to the guards, "Well, I've brought the king a present. I want to give him a gift." "Why would the king want a present from a dirty little beggar girl like you?" asked one of the soldiers. "Well, because," she said, "I've brought him salt." "Salt! Give it to us," said the soldiers. "We'll give it to the king." You see, those soldiers, they wanted to get the reward. But the princess remembered what the witch told her. "Ah, no," she said, "I'll only give the salt to the king himself." So they had to take her to the king. Well, the king was so sick and weak with hunger, he was nearly starved to death. He was laying in his bed. And when he opened his eyes, he saw the princess, but he didn't recognize his own daughter. "What do you want, Tattercoats?" he asked. And she said, "Please, your majesty, I have brought you a gift. I brought you salt." And she put the bag of salt into the king's hands. Well, the king opened the bag and looked. He couldn't believe his eyes. He wet his finger, stuck it into the salt, licked it again. It was salt. Oh, he felt better right away. He called for the cook, and he said, "Take the salt and make me some food right away." Well, the cook tried to do that, but when she got back to the kitchen and she poured the salt out of the bag, she didn't get 3 handfuls of salt. Salt kept coming out of the bag. More salt than the bag could ever hold. Why, so much salt came out of the bag, half the castle, half the city were covered with salt. All the salt the witch made to vanish, it came back in that instant. Well, the king was delighted with this. He turned to the princess and said, "Oh, little ragamuffin, little tattercoat, you saved my life, you saved my people, you brought us salt. Now let me pay you for it. I'll give you whatever you want. Just ask, and I will pay you for the salt." And the princess said, "Father, you cannot pay me for the salt, because, Father, I told you, I love you more than salt." And when the king heard these words, he looked at her again, and at last he recognized his daughter, the one he'd sent away so long before. And when he realized what she meant, the king began to cry. He suddenly realized, we cannot live without salt, and we cannot live without love. They are the same. Well, he begged her forgiveness, and of course the princess forgave her father, and the king asked the princess to stay by his side and help him to run the country, and she did. And not long after, when the king was gone, you know which daughter became the queen? The 3rd princess. She became the queen, and she ruled the kingdom wisely and well, but she never forgot the old witch. Nope. Every month when the moon was full, the young queen would go out into the forest on her own. No friends, no family, no servants, no soldiers. And she'd pay a call on the old witch. And the young queen and the old witch, they'd sit by the fireplace, drinking tea and eating cake and biscuits, and telling stories as they played with a silly old fat black cat. Now, they lived happy. So could we, if we put on the pot now and made some tea. And that's the story, More Than Salt. Well, that's my story. I really hope you liked it. If you'd like to find more stories like that, ask the nice people in the library. They'll know where the folk and fairy tale books are, and the ghost stories and adventure stories. They'll have books with stories from all over the world. They may even have some of Duncan Williamson's books. I hope so. But thanks for listening, and have a good time. And I'll see you again for another story soon, I hope. Bye-bye.